Before we move on to the analysis of the different acts and scenes, I need to explain to you what the two tables or the color-coded tables mean on the screen. On the left-hand side, you will have details of the plot and the progression of action. You might even have some quotes plus little comments on it. But generally on your right-hand side, there will be more detailed quotes as well as commentaries on events that have occurred, as well as comments on the actions of the different characters, or questions for you to think about with regard or in regard to the actions of various characters. So when you do study, remember you're going into the examination with a knowledge of your characters, your plot, very importantly, the themes, and you need to study this information. So you can also use the notes and identify key phrases, clauses, or quotations that you feel will basically contribute to a greater understanding of the text. Welcome grade 12s. Our next lesson will focus on Act 1. We will examine the features of the plot. We will also look at characters and how they evolve during this particular act. And in the course of this, we will also focus on various themes. So in the preceding lessons, we discussed the context in which the drama takes place. For example, their geographical location, namely Denmark. We also focused on the characters and essentially what makes each character tick. What are their values? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? We also examined the various themes of the drama. And so when you read your scene or the text itself, then please make sure that as you are reading, you are unpacking some of these issues. You know, what is the section that you are reading, the text that you are reading, the scene that you are reading, what does it reveal about the theme that the writer wishes to highlight? What does it reveal to us about the character? So here we need to, in essence, unpack the words of the character and really focus on individual aspects of the speech. So, you know, sometimes Shakespearean text is difficult to understand, as I've mentioned, but I also indicated that you should use your textbook, especially the information at the bottom of a particular page. And sometimes there are textbooks that actually have the Shakespearean version of the drama, and on the opposite page there is the modern version of the drama. So use whatever sources or resources you have at your disposal. And I'm going to state this again, your textbook has quite a lot of details that you can use, so start there first. It's very important for you to know the context of the drama, especially the antecedent events, meaning the events which have occurred before the opening of the play. You know, sometimes the dramatist refers to certain events, and as the audience, especially a modern audience, we are not really aware of the events which are cited in the particular text. So what you need to know is that 30 years before the actual commencement of the play itself, old Fortinbras of Norway had challenged old Hamlet, this is young Hamlet's father of Denmark, to a fight so that they could resolve the issue over some disputed territory. Apparently, old Hamlet had then killed Fortinbras and had taken the land that had been the cause of this dispute. Now, it seems as if, by all accounts, that before the fight had actually taken place, that there had been an agreement between the two kings that whoever lost the battle and was eventually killed would then cede the lands then automatically to the victor of the battle. We also know that currently, in the present, when the play opens, Fortinbras's son, young Fortinbras, plans to take back the lands which had been lost by his father, as well as avenge his father's death at the hands of old Hamlet. So he knows that old Hamlet has died, and so he, as an opportunist, he realizes that here is a possible gap or opportunity for him now that a new monarch has been placed on the throne. It would suggest then that he could possibly clamor for the lands which his father had lost and then attack Denmark in the process. Now, at the present moment, he is also quite young, but he is deemed too young to occupy the throne of Norway, and so his uncle is now king. You can see the parallels between Hamlet and young Fortinbras. He gathers an unauthorized army and is basically en route to invade Denmark without the knowledge of his bedridden uncle, and this is why Denmark at the moment is preparing for war, because the king realizes that they are going to be attacked quite soon and they need to prepare to defend the country for this particular attack. Claudius in Act 1, Scene 2 will also refer to this particular event when he discusses the issue with the ambassadors, which he then dispatches to Norway. We've taken a step back 30 years in time. So 1 month previously, old Hamlet of Denmark had died suddenly. Now, according to sources, he had been sleeping in his orchard, and it is said he had been bitten by a poisonous snake, according to his brother Claudius, who had apparently found his body. So Hamlet was studying at the University of Wittenberg, and it seems that Claudius seized the opportunity and claimed the throne. We will discuss why Hamlet does not become king after his father in the next slide, to clarify why it is that Claudius became king. Queen Gertrude, old Hamlet's widow, then marries Claudius soon after her husband's death. Now, this action of his mother's disgusted Hamlet, because firstly he despised his uncle because he feels that his mother actually betrayed his father's memory by marrying or remarrying very soon after his father's sudden death. So she did not even mourn very long. Because she married her husband's brother, this marriage is seen as being an incestuous marriage. I must also state that it must have been very difficult for Hamlet, considering it's very difficult for a child to think of a parent as being a sexual being. And so therefore that could have also contributed to Hamlet's disgust with his mother. Before we move on to actual events of Act 1, we need to answer a question which often crops up and people want to know, have clarity on. So why is Hamlet the king's son? And for most of us, we assume would be the obvious successor to his father's throne. Why is Hamlet then not crowned king of Denmark? Firstly, we know that Hamlet was actually in Germany at the University of Wittenberg at the time that his father died. What many of us don't know is that Denmark had an elective monarchy rather than a hereditary monarchy. Now, a hereditary monarchy is based on primogeniture. And that big word basically just means that primogeniture refers to the fact of the firstborn son. So normally the firstborn son of a king, or we assume that the firstborn son of a king will then succeed his father. In this case, it is not so, because apparently in Denmark, Parliament, who is made up of lords, elected the next king. So we can assume that Claudius must have somehow manipulated the situation and used whatever power Gertrude perhaps had, as well as his own charm and persuasive skills to influence the election. We also know that Hamlet does feel aggrieved by the fact that he was not elected to succeed his father. And this is made quite clear in Act 4, Scene 1, where Hamlet states, "He that hath killed my king and whored my mother popped in between the election and my hopes." So it seems that Hamlet indeed had hopes of succeeding his father in becoming the next monarch or king of Denmark.
As I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, perhaps I did not mention it, but I will mention it now, is that it would be easy for you to remember certain events in a particular act by actually giving it a title, and this title or heading will then summarize what events occur, what the prominent theme is in that particular act. So for this one, I've chosen the quote, "Something is rotten in the state of Denmark." So right at the beginning of the play, the audience becomes aware that something is not quite right. If you look at the word something, it suggests that one is not very clear as to what the cause of the actual instability is in the country. The word rotten suggests that there is corruption of some sort. And so as the reader, you would understand that, right, the play opens on a particularly sour or bad note. And so I must remember that something is not quite right in Denmark. There is some evil that is unleashed, etc. That will be clarified when we discuss events as they unfold when the drama opens. So in Act 1, Scene 1, it takes place very late at night. We are told that it is midnight. We know for an Elizabethan audience who is very superstitious, midnight would suggest the witching hour, where ghosts and goblins would then roam the earth. The action takes place on the battlements of the castle. Now, where are the battlements? It is a section right on top of the castle. There is a kind of platform or passageway that is used by soldiers. And these soldiers are sentries or watchmen who have been instructed to defend the castle and also look out for any attacks. We know that, generally speaking, most castles during that time was surrounded by a moat, a pool of water, obviously to prevent easy access to the castle from opposing folk. We also know that the castle would have a door, and that door is called a drawbridge. And at night, that drawbridge will be pulled up and it will then be secured so that nobody has access to the castle. During the day, however, the drawbridge is lowered and it provides a kind of bridge between anybody on the outside who wishes to come into the castle and those in the castle who then wish to go and survey the countryside or ever has business outside. So it is the witching hour. One of the characters, indeed, it is Bernardo, who is currently on watch. He is extremely nervous. We notice that the sentences that the playwright uses are all quite short, and this displays the anxiety. Currently, Bernardo is on watch and he is waiting for Francisco and the Marcellus to come and relieve him. So he's quite nervous. He says, "Who's there?" And then Francisco has to say they are liegemen to the Dane. And we note that Bernardo is very relieved and he says, "'Tis bitter cold and I am sick at heart." So the audience knows it's quite unpleasant out there. He says he's sick at heart. So as an audience, we realize that he is extremely fearful, he's extremely tense and nervous. So we would want to know, what is it then that has created this nervousness and this anxiety among the characters? We also note that when he says, "I am sick at heart," this would be a suggestion then that he does not feel comfortable It doesn't seem as if he's ill, but we know that something is bothering him. And this very much ties in with this whole concept of corruption and something being rotten in the state of Denmark. He asks Marcellus, so we know that they are very nervous. Bernardo wants Horatio and Marcello to relieve him very quickly, and he says they must make haste. We know that Horatio has been invited by the men to come and verify their sighting of the apparition which has appeared. And Horatio very skeptically asks them, has this thing appeared again tonight? And so the fact that he uses the word this thing very casually shows that he really doesn't believe the sentiment that they have sighted a ghost or an apparition. We know that there is an extremely tense atmosphere, and this atmosphere foreshadows the events which will unfold eventually. We are told that the Horatio has been invited to view the apparition, so as to give credibility to their sighting, so that indeed if they have to share this information with other people, then they could also have Horatio, the scholar there, to vouch for them. It is important that the sighting of the ghost introduces the whole theme of good and evil, and we also know then with the sighting of the ghost, it would then unleash the events which will later transpire in the drama. And so by all accounts then, there is the expectation by the audience that the events that will unfold will eventually then lead to death, because this is indeed a tragedy, and also that there will be a kind of battle between good and evil, which will then also transpire during the course of the drama. So as an Elizabethan audience, the play starts immediately with tension and literal darkness, and so as plans unravel, then we are quite aware and we prepare ourselves to expect a drama where there is going to be much angst, where there's going to be doses of evil, and also as the audience, we are then on the edge of our seats, waiting in anticipation for these events to unfold.
We now continue with Act 1. Remember that something is rotten in the state of Denmark. So the ghost has appeared, and the guards on duty were extremely nervous, and the ghost appears again and is dressed in armor and carries a truncheon or baton, and it seems like it is in the same figure like the king that is dead. So he looks like the recently deceased King Hamlet. And Horatio is encouraged to speak to the ghost. Thou art a scholar, speak to it. Now, what the gods are assuming is that because Horatio speaks Latin, he would be able to, in a way, understand the ghost, and the ghost would understand him, because apparently many exorcisms were conducted in Latin. However, the ghost disappears without saying anything. Horatio then explains why Denmark is preparing for war against an attack from young Fortinbras of Norway to retrieve the Danish territory that he had lost, as well as to avenge his father's death. So that information has already been discussed in the preceding slides. Now, for the guards on duty, it must have been terrifying, because there is a belief that the ghost is a spirit that has returned from purgatory to right a wrong which has been exacted on the person when they were alive. Horatio admits that the ghost resembles the king, and that the frown suggests that there is some strange eruption to our state, and hereby suggesting that there is chaos and disorder somewhere in Denmark that needs to be righted. He also shares some of the political upheavals that are often accompanied by ominous supernatural events, For example, he is saying or suggesting that the appearance of the ghost often foreshadows or suggests or predicts that there will be personal as well as political upheaval in the country. In Act 1, Scene 2, the action moves from the ramparts of the castle to a main hall in the castle where Claudius addresses his subjects. Who are his subjects? His subjects would be the people of Denmark as well as other dignitaries who are present. So this is the first time that we meet Claudius, and as the new king, he has to address his subjects on the matter of his marriage and the fact that he has now been crowned king. So what does he do? He informs the audience of his recent marriage to Gertrude, his brother's widow, and he says that it is possible to balance both joy and sadness. Remember, he has to justify his marriage to his sister-in-law under the very sad circumstances of a country who is still mourning the loss of a king. He also secondly discusses the looming war with Norway and sends ambassadors Cornelius and Voltemant with a message to Fortinbras's elderly uncle, the King of Norway. He then turns to address Laertes and gives him permission to return to France, and we know that Laertes has returned to France only to attend the king's funeral. Note that Hamlet is also in his audience, but we as the audience of the drama are not aware of it because he has not been addressed yet. What you need to notice and focus on in this scene is examine the excellent oratorical and manipulative skills that Claudius has. He's a brilliant speaker. And so he uses language to mask over his immoral action of marrying his brother's wife. So he therefore calls her our sometime sister, now our queen. Also note that the themes of father-son relationships, moral corruption, and revenge are introduced here. How? If you think of Laertes, who's later going to lose his father, we also think of the corruption, here referring to his marriage to Gertrude. We know that this marriage has taken place very quickly after the first king's death. And then also the theme of revenge being introduced with the character of Fortinbras, who is agitating to attack Denmark in order to once again regain the lands which his father had lost. Note the plural pronoun that Claudius uses as a monarch. Now this is called pluratus majestatis. What this big expression virtually means is that often people in power, for example kings, queens, even prime ministers, will use the plural pronoun we, and this pronoun basically implies that they are a representative of the people. So look out in the rest of the play. It is not unusual then for Claudius, when he addresses an audience, to refer to himself not as I, but as we. Claudius finally addresses Hamlet. And he calls Hamlet my cousin Hamlet and my son. Note the order in which he acknowledges Hamlet. He acknowledges Hamlet or addresses him last. Why does he do it last? He first deals with business of the state. Then he also deals with an internal threat, or an external threat. And then he speaks to Laertes, who's not even his own, and I'm going to use the word son reservedly. And then only he turns to Hamlet. What is his intention in doing that? Does he want to show Hamlet that he is now in a position of greater power than what Hamlet is? We also note that Hamlet is quite disgusted by Claudius's words. It seems that he does not want to be acknowledged as Claudius's son, because Hamlet responds and says, and remember when he responds, it is an aside, the audience which Claudius addresses cannot hear what he says. And Hamlet's response is a little more than kin and less than kind. He's extremely sarcastic, and he makes the statement, I am too much in the sun. Notice the pun on sun, because it's a reference to the fact that he's very much now in the public eye, and that he's also the son of Claudius, as well as his father's son. He makes it very clear to the audience what he thinks about Claudius, because he sees he is a little more than just simply family of Claudius. In fact, he is his stepson now that Claudius married his mother, and he makes it very clear also that he is not anything like Claudius. He is less than kind, suggesting that he finds Claudius's behavior and actions of marrying his mother reprehensible. Claudius berates Hamlet for excessive grief. In fact, Claudius goes as far as to imply that Hamlet's grief is unmanly and it is impious stubbornness, suggesting that death is part of the inevitable cycle of life. So it is not, Claudius, yes, is pretending to be concerned about Hamlet, but he is also insulting him, implying that he is unmanly and that he disrespects God's ordinance, because his stubbornness is impious, ungodly, or disrespectful. Gertrude also implores Hamlet, or begs Hamlet to stop grieving. She asks him to cast thy nighted color off. Note the word nighted refers to the black color that Hamlet is wearing. It is a sign that he is still in deep mourning for his father. And Hamlet makes it very clear to his mother that his grief is genuine. He says, I know not, seems, I do not know what it is to pretend. And this is a dig at his mother's short mourning period that she had observed for his father after he had died. So Hamlet then accedes, and she says that because his mother has also asked for him to remain behind in Wittenberg and not go, to remain behind in Denmark and not go back to his studies, he says, I shall in all my best obey you, madam. Notice the comma and then the word madam. There is emphasis on the word madam, and Hamlet is making it very obvious to Claudius that he is obeying his mother, because he does not respect Claudius as being either his father or his monarch. Here he clearly shows his opposition to Claudius and Gertrude's marriage, as well as then his opposition to Claudius's position as king. Now we have to ask ourselves the question, if we look at the order in which Hamlet was addressed by Claudius, we must ask ourselves, is this intentional? And also, why is it that Claudius wants Hamlet to be close at hand, under his eye? Does he realize or feel at this stage that Hamlet could pose a potential political threat to his throne, and it is a matter of keeping his enemies closer? And that is something that, once again, you, the audience, have to figure out or decide for yourself. We do know that Claudius is extremely manipulative, and remember, he has to keep one eye over his shoulder because of his deed against his brother. The scene does not end, so Act 1, Scene 2 continues. It's quite a lengthy one, and here Hamlet is left behind after everyone has left the great hall. In fact, Claudius has left, and Gertrude and the other courtiers, and he then presents his soliloquy, where the audience is given insight into his frame of mind, what he is thinking and what he is feeling at that particular moment. Remember, the soliloquy is not addressed to the audience at all. It is just merely a reflection of the character's thoughts and feelings. We note that Hamlet is extremely depressed. We saw that in his interaction with his mother and the fact that he is dressed entirely in black. And he starts his soliloquy with the words, "Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew." Now, what does this mean? It means that he is so depressed that he just wishes that he could just melt and whatever liquefied form he is in, he could just blend in somewhere, because he cannot seem to cope with the circumstances that he finds himself in. So it is very clear then that Hamlet contemplates suicide, but he cannot commit suicide because it is self-slaughter. According to the Bible, it is seen as a sin. And remember, Hamlet is kind of faced with this dilemma. Hamlet is a thinker. He thinks intensively and he considers, his position in the world. Remember the school of thought that's around him. So on the one hand, you have Renaissance thoughts, which sees self-slaughter or suicide as being a noble act, whereas under Christian ethics, or according to the church, this is seen as being a sin. So he is extremely depressed and he sees his entire world as being stale, flat, and unprofitable. So he doesn't see that there is any value in the world that he exhibits at the moment. He also remarks that Denmark is in a state of moral decay. He says it is an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely. So if we think of an unweeded garden, we know that weeds basically sprout very quickly, and when they do, they could kill whatever beautiful flowers there are in a garden. And so he is saying that the flourishing of immorality in Denmark, the country, and at court is basically killing all things that are moral and good that exists in Denmark. And so if you think of things decaying, there is a suggestion that the situation will only become worse. He also condemns the sudden marriage between his mother and his uncle. And he says, he cannot believe it. He says, "But 2 months dead, nay, not so much." But because he is frustrated that his mother married his uncle within such a short span. And indeed, to the rest of us, it is a very quick time period that his mother has moved on in. Now, when he refers to his mother, it seems as if her actions have clouded his judgment on all women. He compares Claudius to his father, and he finds Claudius far inferior to that of his father. It seems that Hamlet places his deceased father, his dead father, on a pedestal. He sees him as being Hyperion, the sun god, and he describes Claudius as a satyr, a lustful beast. You know, that image that is often presented to us of a mythological creature who has the body of a goat but the face of a man. So he sees Claudius as being a lustful, debased and depraved creature. Unfortunately for women and for Ophelia, he allows his mother's actions to cloud his judgment of all women. He says, "Frailty, thy name is woman." Why? Because his mother married his uncle so shortly after his father's death. He says, "She married, oh, most wicked speed." And he mentions the incestuous sheets. He sees then all women as being immoral, fickle beings who exploit their sexuality for gain. And he compares her to Niobe to highlight her hypocrisy. Who is Niobe? Niobe was a woman in mythology who had 14 children, and she boasted to the gods about her fertility, and as punishment, the gods killed all her children and she was turned to stone. But the statue or the stone that used to be Niobe also shed tears. And so Hamlet is suggesting that when his father died, his mother shed copious tears. Yet, very soon after her mourning period, she married his uncle. Now, in those days, a widow was supposed to mourn her husband and wear black for a certain period. In some countries, that period of observation was 12 months. Here, Gertrude did not even observe a mourning period of 2 months. It seems that within a span of 6 weeks to 2 months, she had married her husband's brother. Once Hamlet then is extremely depressed, we can see his hatred of women, and while he is sitting there, Horatio joins him and informs him that he has seen the ghost of Hamlet's father. The action now moves to a scene in Polonius's house, and it's Act 1, Scene 3. So we meet Polonius and his children. Now remember, I said at some point that all characters that are created by a playwright have a significant role to play in the drama. They are not accidental. They are key in events which are going to unfold. And so we meet the brother and sister Laertes and Ophelia, and Laertes warns Ophelia not to take Hamlet's attentions too seriously. He says, as a prince, this is just a trifling and short-lived. He refers to violence and that Hamlet is using Ophelia for his own amusement. Now, if you look at the word trifling, it means that Hamlet is not serious about his attentions for her. He implies also, at the same time, that Hamlet does not see Ophelia as being worthy of being a royal wife and being his princess should she marry him. She, however, warns her brother to actually follow his own advice. This warning that she gives him, really shows us that Ophelia is not this biddable young woman only. Here for the first time and the only time in the drama, she is quite witty and feisty. So note, Laertes says to her, listen, this young man is not interested in you. He's basically interested in your body, and he's going to ruin you because you are only just a toy for him. His reference to violence suggests that Hamlet's interest in her will wane very soon, and Hamlet, just like violets do, because when flowers blossom, they die also at some point in time. It is at this point that her father also comes in, and he gives his son long, rambling advice about how to behave with decorum in Paris. And here we really get to know Polonius. As an audience, we don't respect Polonius because sometimes he makes these ridiculous, paradoxical statements. He seems to be so, as we say, full of his own importance and thinks so much of himself and the advice that he gives others. So at some points he cuts a very comical figure, and he provides some lighter relief sometime in the drama. And so his advice is quite contradictory. It's long-winded, and it's indicative of his behavior. He's pompous, or as we would say, he's very full of himself and his own importance, and he's a very overbearing parent. He wants to know what is happening in the lives of his children, and he's meddling. He's a meddler, in fact. Now, when he gives Laertes advice, He, however, commands or instructs Ophelia as if she is a mere child. So here we already see that women are not treated as equals of men. Laertes speaks down to his sister as she were a child, and his father does exactly the same. So when Laertes leave, Polonius actually interrogates Ophelia on the conversation that she had with Laertes. And he tells her also, when she informs him that Hamlet, they've had the conversation of Hamlet's interest in her, he actually tells her that he has been very much aware of this budding relationship. Now that suggests to us that he spies on her, and it tells her that Hamlet is only pretending to love her in order to sleep with her, because he says, do not believe his vows, they are more mere implorators of unholy suits, the better to be guile. So Hamlet's unholy suit then is basically to seduce Ophelia. Now, as a father, Polonius is concerned, yes, about his daughter, but his warning to Ophelia is actually to protect his own reputation, because he's saying to her, if your reputation is ruined, then it will also soil my reputation. A kind of reminder, I am the chamberlain of the royal house, so you need to watch yourself, my girl. When he speaks to her, he speaks down to her as if she is a child. Note, when he speaks to her, he uses imperative verbs. He tells her, he commands her. This is not a conversation that he has with an equal. He says, he uses words like you must not. He says, be, set, do not believe. So if you see those, look at those words and clauses and imperative verbs, it makes it very clear that he sees her as a child who needs constant advice from her father. This scene is important because it demonstrates to us the patriarchal structure that is very much embedded in Danish and Renaissance society. And remember, this family is but an example or a microcosm of how the world thinks and how things should evolve. In Act 1, Scene 2, at the end of the act, then Horatio informs Hamlet that he had seen his father's ghost on the ramparts of the castle the previous night. For obvious reasons, Hamlet would be curious then to see this for himself. Remember, he's in deep mourning for his father. So in Act 1, Scene 4, the action then moves to a platform once again on the battlements of Elsinore. In the background, we hear sounds of celebration. Claudius is actually celebrating his coronation, and Hamlet is very bitter about this, and he implies that Claudius is quite hedonistic and that this kind of partying late into the night has become a very common feature or at the castle after Claudius became king. The ghost then appears and beckons Hamlet to follow, and Horatio and Marcellus hold him back because they are scared that the ghost might basically be a demon laying a trap for him. You know, Hamlet questions the ghost's appearance, and he says, he addresses him and he asks, be thou a spirit of health or a goblin damned? You know, you can sense the desperation when he says, I'll call thee Hamlet, king, father, royal Dane. So once again, he shows his respect for his deceased father. And while they are trying to hold him back, you know, he struggles against them and he says, my fate cries out and makes each petty artery in this body as hard as the Nemean lion's nerve. So he fights them off and he runs off so that he can go and speak to the ghost, and his reference to the Nemean lion shows his fierce determination to actually speak to his father's ghost. It is Marcellus who makes the statement that something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Remember, people were extremely superstitious, so whenever there was some kind of ghostly appearance, it would be an indication that on earth amongst human beings, something was awry. And remember, we spoke about the chain of being, and as an audience, we are later going to find out that somewhere in the chain, things have come undone, and therefore Denmark is in that rotten state, which Marcellus comments on. So at the end of Act 1, Scene 4, Hamlet has run off, leaving behind Horatio and the other guards in pursuit of the ghost of his father. In Act 1, Scene 5, Hamlet now confronts the ghost, and the ghost tells Hamlet, or gives him a version of how he died. So instructs Hamlet to revenge his foul and most unnatural murder. And he describes in detail how he was killed. He says that the official version that the king had been stung by a serpent while he was asleep in his orchard is false. He says, the serpent that did sting thy father's life now wears his crown. And so it is obvious that Claudius is the serpent who killed old King Hamlet while he was sleeping in his orchard. The ghost also describes in detail how he was sleeping and how Claudius had poured the poison into his ear and how his skin had broken into sores. So he had died a very painful death. He also says that his soul will not be able to rest because he had died without being able to confess his sins, and therefore he is in purgatory. He needs Hamlet to avenge his death so that his soul can move on. He calls Claudius an incestuous adulterist beast. Now note that the ghost words and Hamlet's words are quite similar, because Hamlet also referred to Claudius in his soliloquy as being a satyr, a lustful beast. And here the ghost uses the words adulterate beast. So both both Hamlet and the ghost have the same perception of Claudius and Gertrude's marriage. He begs him not to let the royal bed of Denmark become a coach for luxury and damned incest. His reference perhaps to luxury is Claudius's rule, and at the beginning of Act 1, Scene 4, we mentioned the sounds of a party or banquet or feast that can be heard. So it seems as if the ghost thinks that Claudius will not be able to be a very good king because he seems to be quite hedonistic and not very serious about his role as monarch. And then once again, the reference to the marriage as being an incestuous one, indeed, as was mentioned before. He begs Hamlet not to harm his mother. He says, taint not thy mind, nor let thy soul contrive against thy mother aught. Leave her to heaven. So he instructs Hamlet to, yes, take revenge for my death, but do not harm your mother. Let God be her judge. He also swears the guards and Horatio to secrecy. He tells Horatio what his plans are, that he's going to put on an antic disposition. But he also bemoans the fact that the time is out of joint, oh cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right. So, sometimes when we experience challenges in our own lives, especially if there are universal problems or problems that a community or country experience. You ask yourself, why was I ever born at this particular time? You know, I wish I could have been born under some other star or somewhere else or at another time. And so this is the same kind of question that Hamlet asks. Because firstly, by nature, Hamlet is not a fighter, he's not aggressive, he's not hot-headed, he is not a doer, rather Hamlet is a thinker. And so Hamlet bemoans the fact that he now is forced to avenge his father's death. Now this also presents the dilemma. Remember, we said that in Renaissance society, it was acceptable to avenge somebody and kill a person to revenge the death or avenge the death of somebody else, whereas within the context of Christianity, killing someone is seen as a sin. So this is the dilemma then that Hamlet faces. Hamlet then reluctantly accepts his responsibilities. Although he realizes that he is not keen to do this, he knows that it is his obligation as his father's son to avenge his father's death. And so now the links between Hamlet and Fortinbras become very clear, that Fortinbras is also currently seeking vengeance for his father's death, and Hamlet now, our protagonist, is also thrown into onto the same path where he has to avenge his own father's death.